Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something I find really fascinating, glossolalia.
You mean like speaking in tongues, right?
Yeah, exactly. And our source for this whole thing is actually just one person's account,
Oh, okay.
but it's a pretty amazing account. It's this guy, David Lane,
Yeah.
and he not only experienced speaking in tongues firsthand,
Oh.
but then he also spent decades kind of reflecting on it and thinking about what it all means.
Uh,
So that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that makes Lane's perspective so unique is that he doesn't just come at this as, a true believer. He's actually incredibly critical and inquisitive about his own experiences.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Like he's always trying to analyze things from different angles. And he even draws these really interesting parallels between speaking in tongues and other mystical experiences.
And even everyday life, which I thought was really cool. He's not afraid to kind of push the boundaries of how we think about these things.
Right. Okay. So let's start with Lane's own experience with glossolalia. He describes his first encounter with it as a teenager at this charismatic Catholic event.
Oh, wow.
And it sounds like it was really intense for him.
Like, how so?
Well, he describes it as this almost overwhelming feeling, like this surge of energy just kind of taking over his whole body.
I've heard other people describe similar things, right? Like a feeling of being totally overtaken by something much bigger than themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And he talks about this sense of connection to something beyond himself, which seems to be a common thread in a lot of accounts of glossolalia. But what I found interesting is that Lane also talks about the less glamorous side of all of this.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, he mentions how this tongues fever kind of spread through his school after his experience.
Oh, wow. Like contagious.
Yeah, but then he says it quickly devolved into all this mimicry and social pressure, which made him start to question if it was even authentic.
That's a really good point because it makes you wonder, how much of this is genuine and how much of it is people just kind of going along with the crowd.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Lane doesn't shy away from those tough questions.
Yeah.
Like he really dives into the whole debate about whether this is actually a divine gift or not.
And especially since speaking in tongues isn't just a Christian thing, right? You find it in other religions and cultures all over the world.
Right. And that's what I think makes this whole topic so fascinating because it suggests that maybe there's something more universal about human consciousness at play here.
Yeah, like maybe it points to some deeper capacity that we all have for connecting to something beyond ourselves.
Right. So how does Lane actually try to explain what causes this phenomenon, both in his own experience and more broadly?
Well, he talks about a few different factors that might contribute to it. He emphasizes the importance of receptivity, like being open to the experience.
Okay, so there's that aspect of being willing to let go and kind of surrender to whatever might happen.
Yeah, and he also says there's often this element of surprise involved. Like it's not something you can just force or consciously control.
That makes sense.
Eh.
And he also brings up the possibility of energy or influence being transmitted from other people, right? Like he mentions how there was this really charismatic leader at that event who was known for invoking glossolalia in others.
Oh, wow. So like the power of suggestion almost.
Yeah, exactly. It
That.
makes you think about whether the presence of someone like that could actually trigger the experience in others.
Which raises the question, is this something that's purely internal that then manifests externally?
Mm.
Or can external factors like social dynamics or a charismatic figure actually play a role in triggering it?
Right. Like which comes first, the internal state or the outward expression? It's kind of a chicken or the egg situation.
Totally. But then Lane throws this really interesting comparison into the mix. He compares speaking in tongues to what happens during sex.
Wait, what?
I know it sounds kind of out there, but hear me out. He's not saying that the two experiences are the same or anything. It's more of an analogy to illustrate how both are ultimately outward expressions of really intense internal states.
Okay, so the idea is that just like moans or cries of passion are a natural response to physical arousal, speaking in tongues might be a similar response, but to a different kind of arousal, maybe a spiritual one.
Exactly. And Lane's point is that in both cases, the focus shouldn't be solely on the vocalization itself, but on understanding that internal state that precedes it. That internal state is really the key.
That makes a lot of sense. But then that brings us back to the whole issue of mimicry, right?
Yeah.
Like Lane talks about how easy it can be to imitate speaking in tongues, especially in settings where it's expected or praised.
Yeah, he actually witnessed this firsthand when he was leading prayer meetings. And he started to suspect that a lot of the people claiming to speak in tongues were just mimicking what they'd heard others do.
So it becomes less about a genuine spiritual experience and more about fitting in or seeking approval from the group.
Exactly. It just goes to show how powerful social dynamics can be, especially within a religious context.
And Lane takes this observation even further. He talks about something he calls transference and projection. He noticed that his own experience with glossolalia initially made him believe in the truth of the Bible.
Oh, wow.
But then later on, he realized that this could be a kind of pitfall.
How so?
Well, his idea is that after you have this really powerful personal experience like that, it's easy to start projecting meaning onto external sources, like you're trying to find validation or explanation for what you just went through.
So in his case, he was already primed to accept the Bible as truth because it offered an explanation for speaking in tongues. But he realized that if he had been given a different book from a different religion that also offered an explanation, he might have just as easily been convinced of that religion's truth instead.
Exactly. And that's a really crucial point because it highlights how our personal experiences, especially the ones that feel extraordinary or otherworldly, can really shape our entire belief systems.
It's a good reminder to be aware of those influences and to always question our own assumptions.
So after decades of reflecting on all of this, where does Lane stand on speaking in tongues? Does he have any definitive answers?
He's pretty honest about the fact that it still remains somewhat of a mystery even to him. He doesn't dismiss it as just a psychological quirk, but he's also hesitant to label it solely as a divine gift. It seems like he's really trying to grapple with all the complexities.
Yeah, and that's what I appreciate about his perspective.
Hmm.
He's not afraid to admit that he doesn't have all the answers.
Right. And he even offers up some alternative explanations, too, right? Something about evolutionary throwbacks.
Yeah, he suggests that glossolalia could be a kind of recursive throwback to the early stages of language development in humans. Like maybe it's tapping into some ancient neural pathway that's still present within us.
That's a really interesting idea because it means that even if we can't definitively say it's divine communication, it could still hold a significant place in our evolutionary history and how we developed as social creatures.
So we're left with this really fascinating puzzle. And even though we might not have all the pieces yet, I think the process of exploring those different possibilities is what makes this so worthwhile.
Totally. And I think that's a great takeaway from Lane's story. It's not about finding a simple answer. It's about embracing the mystery and continuing to ask questions.
Absolutely. And speaking of mysteries, Lane has another really intriguing anecdote that sheds even more light on his evolving perspective. And we'll dive into that right after this quick break.
So this anecdote that kind of shifted things for Lane happened years after his initial experience with glossolalia.
Oh, this is one about his neighbors, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
He was kept awake one night by this couple in a nearby apartment,
Oh, no.
having very enthusiastic sex.
And it was pretty loud, apparently.
I can only imagine.
But as Lane was laying there listening to all this commotion, he had this realization.
Well,
He started thinking about his own speaking in tongues experience. And he wondered, what if he hadn't been in an environment where he was expected to vocalize? What if there hadn't been that pressure or expectation to actually speak?
so like what if the setting had been totally different?
Exactly. Would the glossolia have still happened that? Would he have experienced that internal state regardless of the outward expression?
That's a really interesting question. It kind of challenges the assumption that the speaking part is the core of the whole phenomena.
Right. Lane's point is that the speaking in tongues, the vocalization, was simply an outward expression of an internal state that was already present.
Okay, so like the internal state is the source,
Mm.
and the speaking is just a byproduct.
Yeah, exactly. And he compares it to those involuntary vocalizations that happen during sex.
Wait, are you saying that speaking in tongues is like moaning during sex?
Well, not exactly. It's more about recognizing that in both cases, the vocalization itself is a symptom, not the cause.
Okay, so the vocalization isn't the main event. It's more like a side effect.
Precisely. And Lane observed that in some Christian traditions, speaking in tongues is treated as the goal itself, as if it were the main event.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Like it's seen as this sign that you've reached a certain level of spiritual connection.
Right. But Lane argues that this intense focus on the outward act of speaking in tongues might actually prevent some people from fully experiencing that deeper internal state of ecstasy or spiritual awareness.
So it's like they're so focused on achieving the outward manifestation that they miss the internal source.
Exactly. And this ties back to his observations about mimicry. Lane suggests that one of the reasons speaking in tongues can spread so rapidly in some groups is because it's relatively easy to imitate.
You mean like people could just fake it?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Uh.
And he saw this firsthand when he was leading those prayer meetings. He suspected that a lot of people claiming to speak in tongues were actually just mimicking what they heard others do.
Driven by social pressure or a desire to fit in.
Right. Which just highlights how powerful social dynamics can be, especially in the religious context. It can make people act in ways they might not otherwise.
And Lane also talks about how these intense experiences, whether genuine or not, can sometimes lead people to project meaning onto religious texts or figures.
Yeah, he calls this transference, where the power of the experience, the emotional weight of it, gets transferred onto something external.
So it's like you're trying to make sense of this profound internal experience by looking for explanations outside of yourself.
Exactly. And Lane admits that after his initial Glossolalia experience, he was convinced that the Bible had to be true. It felt like confirmation.
But then he realized that maybe he was just projecting his own experience onto the text.
Right. He started to question whether he would have felt the same way if he had been given a different religious text, one that also offered an explanation for speaking in tongues.
That's a really profound insight. It
Right.
makes you wonder how much of what we believe is shaped by these internal experiences rather than objective evidence.
Absolutely. It's a reminder to always examine our own biases and to be critical of the sources we rely on for information.
So after all this wrestling with the topic, does Lane have any definitive answers about speaking in tongues?
Well, he's very upfront about the fact that it remains a mystery to him. He doesn't think it's just a psychological phenomenon, but he's also hesitant to call it a purely divine gift.
So he's still open to different possibilities.
Exactly. And he even proposes a few other potential explanations, like maybe it's a vestige of our evolutionary past.
Oh yeah, he talks about that recursive throwback idea.
Right. Perhaps it's a leftover from the early stages of human language development. Or maybe it served as a way to signal ecstatic states within early human groups, like a form of social bonding.
So even if we can't definitively say it's communication with a higher power, it could still be a significant piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding human evolution and behavior.
Exactly. And that's what I find so compelling about Lane's perspective. He doesn't shy away from the ambiguity and the unanswered questions. He invites us to consider all the different facets of this phenomenon and to appreciate the complexity of it all.
And that open-mindedness, I think, is really important when approaching any topic that we don't fully understand, especially when it comes to something as personal and subjective as religious experience.
I agree. It's about embracing the mystery and recognizing that sometimes the journey of exploration is just as valuable as arriving at a definitive answer.
So it sounds like Lane is saying it's okay to not have all the answers.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from his story. Like, it's okay to embrace the mystery and just keep asking questions.
But if we try to step back from those specifically religious interpretations of speaking in tongues, what can we learn from all this, even if we've never experienced glossolalia ourselves?
That's a good question. I think one thing that really stands out is how much our internal states can influence our outward behavior.
Okay, so like how our thoughts and feelings can shape our actions.
Exactly. Whether it's something as dramatic as speaking in tongues or even just everyday things like laughing or crying, our bodies are constantly finding ways to express what's going on inside.
And sometimes those expressions might be totally involuntary, right? Like we don't even realize we're doing them.
Right, it's like our subconscious mind is taking over.
And Lane's experience shows just how powerful those subconscious forces can be. They can shape our beliefs, our perceptions of the world, even our entire sense of reality.
And we also have to consider the role of our social environment, right? Like we talked about how easily speaking in tongues can be mimicked.
Yeah, how sometimes it's more about fitting in than having a genuine spiritual experience.
Exactly. Which raises all sorts of questions about how our social surroundings can influence our behavior, sometimes without us even realizing it.
It's like we're constantly trying to figure out how to be ourselves while also navigating the expectations of the people around us.
And that's a balancing act that we all have to deal with in different ways. I think Lane's story encourages us to be mindful of those social pressures, to question our assumptions, and to approach these kinds of phenomena with a healthy dose of critical thinking.
And most importantly, to never lose our sense of curiosity.
Right, because even if we don't find all the answers, the pursuit of understanding is a valuable experience in itself.
So if speaking in tongues isn't necessarily about talking to God, what other possibilities are there? What could it tell us about human evolution or the nature of consciousness?
Maybe it's a remnant of how our brains first learned to communicate, or a way to signal altered states of awareness within social groups, or something else entirely that we haven't even considered yet.
It's a fascinating mystery and one that I think will continue to intrigue people for generations to come.
And who knows, maybe someday we'll have more pieces of the puzzle, but until then, the exploration itself is what's truly rewarding.
So for anyone listening out there, if you've ever had an experience that you couldn't quite explain, or if you're just curious about the hidden depths of human consciousness,
Yeah.
I think Lane's story is a great reminder to embrace the unknown and to keep asking those tough questions.
Because sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the ones we make about ourselves.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure. And as always, keep exploring.